Thanks for coming along tonight to hear Julian Leeser make a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He's been here a few times before and he's always welcome to return. You know him well. I'll introduce him briefly. He graduated in arts and law. He worked as a company director. He worked as an associate of a High Court judge. He's worked in the Menzies Research Centre. He's worked at the Australian Catholic University, but most importantly, the member for Berowra in Sydney, and he's held very serious senior since 2016, in which he's held senior positions in the Coalition. So tonight, the member for Berowra and the Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Health, Aged Care and Sport, Julian Leeser, is going to talk for us on the issue of social cohesion in Australia, the challenge. Julian Leeser, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Gerard. It's an honour and a privilege to be here this evening at the Sydney Institute. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respect to elders past and present. And let me acknowledge you, Gerard and Anne, and all the board members of the Sydney Institute. I'm particularly honoured to be asked to speak about social cohesion this evening at the invitation of Gerard, a person who's played a major role in Australia's public life over many decades and someone who's written and spoken about Australia's culture and our social cohesion for almost all of that time. You've done so, Gerard, if I may say, with a view to make Australia a stronger place, and for that I thank you, and I thank you tonight for the opportunity to provide my perspective on this important topic. With the King in town this week, I've thought about the works and the words of my first political mentor, the late Sir Asher Joel, a proud Jewish Australian. Sir Asher was variously a journalist, a parliamentarian, a naval officer and a founder of Australia's public relations industry. He was the organiser of many royal tours. He published the Bible on Australian public etiquette called Protocol and Procedures. Sir Asher wrote, "Protocol is after all another name for good manners, and the procedures are the form by which they are observed." The protocols which have underpinned the success of Australian society are embodied in the obligations outlined in the Citizenship Pledge, which says, "I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, and whose laws I will uphold and obey." The pledge outlines the obligations of all Australians: to be loyal to Australia and put Australians first, to believe in a system of government where the people are sovereign, to respect the rights and freedoms of other citizens, to obey and support our laws. These are not onerous obligations, but when their observance breaks down, so society also breaks down. Earlier this week, I had the privilege of attending the reception at Parliament House to mark the visit of the King and Queen to Australia. The Prime Minister, a Republican, and the Leader of the Opposition, a monarchist, made appropriate speeches acknowledging the significance of King Charles' affection for Australia and the warm welcome he'd received in Australia. I think my leader, Peter Dutton, captured the mood of the occasion when he said, and I quote, "We hope your spirits have been lifted by the response that you've received so far, yesterday in Sydney and today at the War Memorial, and indeed here in this hall in this eclectic gathering. People have had haircuts, you can see I didn't. People have shined shoes, suits have been pressed," and he said, "and that's just Republicans." "As we know, Your Majesty, you're a most welcome guest in the country." The King then spoke of his affection for Australia and its people and the particular way the country has helped to shape him. It was a perfectly fine state occasion. Differences were acknowledged, but the protocols and procedures were observed. Then, following the King's speech, Lydia Thorpe, a former Green senator turned independent, approached the dais and yelled at the King, "This is not your land. You are not my king. You destroyed our land. Give us a treaty. We want a treaty in this country. You are a genocidalist." Security officers were forced to intervene and escort her from the premises as she shouted, "F the colony." My friend Linda Burney, the former Minister for Indigenous Australians, put it well when she said, "Whether you agree with the institution of the monarchy, there's an element of respect that needs to come into play, and I don't think Lydia did herself any favours or acted respectfully yesterday." Lydia Thorpe, who refuses to acknowledge the Australian nation but serves in its parliament, embodies why social cohesion in this country is under strain. Lydia Thorpe is also one of Parliament's most outspoken anti-Israel activists and regularly wears her keffiyeh in the chamber with other members of her former party, actively participates in the increasingly violent anti-Israel gatherings. Now, Lydia Thorpe is entitled to her views. Disagreement and debate are the stuff of our democracy. But what Lydia Thorpe did this week is an example of the problem Australia is currently facing. There are people who are seeking to change Australian society who don't have any regard for Australia's democratic beliefs or its people or their rights and liberties and their laws. Australian social cohesion is breaking down because of the failure of people in leadership in Australia, political leaders, police, university leaders and the Human Rights Commission and others, to enforce the law and the values underpinning the Citizenship Pledge. Social cohesion only works if people obey the law and that law is enforced against everyone equally. Around the world, Western democracies are under strain from anarchists who believe that the usual rules don't apply to them. They destroy property and the symbols of Western culture. They throw paint at old masters. They behead statues. They burn flags. They storm democratic buildings and they disrupt public events. They graffiti public and private property. They intimidate their fellow citizens in their suburbs, in their schools and in their places of worship. These people keep pushing the envelope and they keep testing the resolve of governments, academics and law enforcement, all of which have shown themselves to be wanting in an age when we need people to just simply enforce the law and make an example of those who transgress. The treatment of Jews in Western society is a test case for the multiculturalism that has existed in those societies. Does the protection of the rights of citizens in those societies extend to Jewish people, or are those societies now governed by a woke philosophy which sees Jews as a racially privileged group, robbed of their God-given individuality and agency? That's why the way we deal with anti-Semitism sets us up for the sort of society we will be in the future. Are we to be a society based on conspiracy or fact, on othering or personal responsibility, on social discord or social harmony? Now, governing a society is no different to running a family. In families, parents set and enforce boundaries. Psychologists tell us, and I can agree with them as a parent of a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, that children crave boundaries. And while they constantly test them, when the boundaries are enforced, children learn right from wrong, good from bad behaviour. In societies, citizens crave boundaries, and they need them enforced, otherwise those societies break down. There have always been, and there will always be, different views about political issues in Australia. But when people move outside the realms of the law to express those differences and disagreements, and there's no consequence for doing so, then society ultimately breaks down. The growing number of people who believe that the law doesn't apply to them, and the moral cowardice of leaders and their failure to enforce the law, has created the sense of breakdown in social cohesion that exists here today. John Howard often said that the things which unite us as Australians are far greater than those which divide us. That remains the view of the vast middle of Australia. The greater concern that I have is the longer this failure to enforce the law and demonstrate the consequence of behaviour exists, the more we're sending the wrong signal to the next generation of Australians about what is acceptable conduct in this country. It's almost exactly 12 months to this day since I spoke at the Sydney Institute last. It was the 3rd of October 2023. At that time, we were having a debate about changing the Constitution. It was a debate where Australians had different views, but it was a debate that was for the large part conducted civilly. Had I been asked then, I would never have predicted the basic decline in civil norms and the outbreak of lawlessness that we've seen over the last 12 months since the October 7 terrorist attacks. It's very difficult to argue that Australia has become a stronger and more cohesive country in the last 12 months. While there are a range of factors that affect Australia's social cohesion, it would be remiss of me not to pay particular attention to what has happened in this country since those terrorist attacks on October 7. On October 7, the world changed. Not Israel, not the world for Jews, but the entire democratic world. Australia has been the world's most successful multicultural society, but the failure of our institutions to defend the right of law-abiding Australians since October 7 has been a surprise and shock to many. On October 7, the world saw the largest murder of Jews on a single day since the Holocaust. The attacks took place on the festival of Simchat Torah, a joyous holiday celebrating the annual cycle of reading the Torah, where Jews dance with the Torah in the synagogue as if it were a bride. Tomorrow, around the world, Jewish people will be celebrating the first Simchat Torah since October 7. This year, coinciding with what's usually a joyous time, memorial services are being held around the world to remember the victims of October 7. As we know, on that day, 1,200 men, women and children were slaughtered in their homes, in kibbutzim and at a music festival. In an age of violent movies and games, the deaths of 1,200 people can be mistaken for just another statistic. While the taking of any human life is a tragedy, what marked out these deaths was the sadistic nature of the killings. Hamas wanted people to watch the depravity of what they did. That's why they filmed the acts and broadcast them in real time. The murders, the rapes of wives in front of husbands, the butchery of children in front of their parents. The Hamas terrorists revelled in the satanic way they tortured and killed people, and then Gazans cheered as the terrorists spat on Jewish corpses that were paraded through the streets. Those slaughtered that day included babies, Holocaust survivors, young people attending music festivals, and people who'd devoted their lives to better relations with Palestinians. What we saw that day was the worst of humankind, a horrendous act that would surely draw immediate and unequivocal condemnation and see enduring international solitude. Condemnation did follow. Leaders around the world spoke out against the horror, knowing that Nova Music Festival could have been any music festival in their own countries. The horrors that occurred that day are an ongoing reality for 100 hostages currently being held underground by the terrorists and for their families. Australia is a Western liberal democracy. We believe in the rule of law and we protect the rights of minorities in this country. Australia's foreign policy tradition is that we stand with like-minded Western liberal democracies, particularly against external threats. One would have thought, therefore, that Australia and Australians would stand unequivocally with Jewish people, as we stood with America after 9/11, and as other Western liberal democracies stood with us and Indonesia after the Bali bombings. And it's true to say that many Australians did and still do stand with Jewish people. My personal experience of the weeks that followed the terrorist attacks was of great support from my electorate. I represent very few Jewish Australians, and for many people in the electorate, I'm the only Jewish person they know. I remember the kindness of the parishioners at St Stephen's Anglican Church, Normanhurst, who brought flowers to my office because they didn't know what else to do to express their feelings of sorrow and solidarity. The statement that was put out by the local Catholic Bishop, Anthony Randazzo of Broken Bay, who condemned the attacks and expressed solidarity with the Jewish people. Being on pre-poll for the referendum, and volunteers from both sides of the debate wanting to check in on me and see that I was okay, and expressing their support for Jewish Australians. Even a year on, almost every week this still happens. A random person, often a stranger in my electorate, comes up to me and says, "Thank you for standing against anti-Semitism. Thank you for standing our values." And strangely, it's most often accompanied by a hug, something you rarely experience in politics. But it's a sign of the emotional connection of fair-minded Australians with what's happened in the world and in our country today. Though just as soon as the tributes flowed, so did the words which sought to call into doubt the barbaric actions of the Hamas terrorists or downplay its significance, with others justifying those attacks. The immediacy and the callousness with which the massacre took place was justified by some as a moral crusade against the State of Israel, even before the commencement of Israel's operations in Gaza. But worst and more alarmingly was the celebration. And the celebrations continued not far from where we are sitting this evening. Previously hidden from public view, anti-Jewish displays were held proudly at Australian landmarks. The gathering at the Sydney Opera House on October 9 was designed to send a signal to the world. Pro-Hamas protesters descended chanting anti-Jewish slogans. They set off flares and burnt flags under the watchful eye of the police. The protesters, through their actions, demonstrated their contempt. They acted as though they were outside the law, and seemingly, given the lack of arrests, tacit approval for the non-peaceful protests they were. At the same time, on the very same night, law-abiding Jewish Australians were told not to come into the city. The day after the terrorist attack, at a rally in Western Sydney organised by the radical Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir, they celebrated the October 7 massacre. Sheikh Ibrahim Dadoun gave a speech where he said, "I'm smiling, I'm happy, I'm elated. It's a day of courage. It's a day of resistance. It's a day of pride. This is the day we've been waiting for." Imagine that. Within a day, while operations to recover bodies and the search for survivors continued as first responders were wading through the carnage at the kibbutzim, anti-Semitism was unleashed in Australia, and it was unashamed. Looking back to 2001, it would be unimaginable to see such widespread support for terrorists that we list as terrorists in our own country, who murdered 3,000 people in the September 11 terrorist attacks. Yet here in Australia, there were those delighting in Jewish suffering. On October 10 in Melbourne, people in a car stopped and asked a man on the street if he knew where the Jews were. He asked what they'd do if they found any Jews, and they responded, "They'll know what we're going to do once we're done with them." Another passenger in the car said, "We're hunting for Jews." The National Socialist Network flew a banner that said "Expose Jewish power" over Flinders Street station in Melbourne on the 14th of October. 20 to 30 National Socialist Network members dressed in black with balaclavas then marched onto the station, doing Hitler salutes, and entered the train. It was reported they questioned passengers to see if any of them were Jewish. All around our country, there has been a growing sense of lawlessness since the 7th of October. The intimidatory drive-thrus in Jewish suburbs, the confrontations outside synagogues, the vandalism and firebombing of MPs' electorate offices, an event I regard as a terrorist attack simpliciter. The vandalism of war memorials, the vandalism of Jewish properties, including schools, calling for death to Jews, hate preachers being openly calling for the murder of Jews and vilifying Jews as being subhuman, the doxing of Jewish creatives, artists and small businesses, a Greens MP repeating anti-Semitic tropes without being censured by her own party, posters of Hitler going up all over Jewish suburbs, protests outside Jewish schools and synagogues. There were violent protests at the Victorian Labor Conference, which saw MPs being jostled and attacked and delayed the conference, forcing the Victorian Premier and Deputy Premier into a safe room. There were violent and aggressive protests at peaceful rallies against anti-Semitism, trespassing on and defacing federal parliament, and on our university campuses where violence and intimidation go unchecked, where rapes are denied and where Hizb ut-Tahrir gets a seat at the table. There are protesters flaunting the laws designed to stop support of terrorist organisations or the display of their symbols on our streets or the glorification of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders by displaying their colours or versions of their symbols and flags with every intention of thumbing their noses at the laws, but just the right side of the line so they don't get caught. The violence involved in the Melbourne riots outside the Land Forces exhibition reached a new and unprecedented level. Rioters threw acid, faeces, bags of vomit, padlocks, apples, chairs, canned food and bottles at the police. They punched horses and destroyed property. They set alight plastic bins and prevented firefighters from getting to them so that chemical fumes from burning plastics would pervade the air. And Greens MPs encouraged and participated in such protests. The protesters get more brazen because too often they're not dealt with by the full force of the law. Against this, yesterday, I went with the Liberal candidate for Wentworth, Roe Knox, and the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, Senator James Patterson, and the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton. And we visited Avner's, a Jewish-owned bakery in Surrey Hills. We met the owner, Ed Halmayig, I think I've said his name right, Halmagi, sorry, a man of remarkable resilience and passion for his business and for our country. I'm sure you've heard about the recent attacks on Avner's, where the store was graffitied with the red triangle symbol of Hamas and a note warning, "Be careful," shoved under the door. Ed told me about another incident which received much less publicity. One morning, two men, inner city types, wearing their chambray shirts, their chinos and R.M. Williams, but with kaffirs and gloves, approached him at his store. Now, Ed has nothing to do with the government of Israel or the decisions of the IDF. He's just a baker, and he happens to be Jewish, and he makes great bagels and babka. That didn't matter to these two men. They threw dog excrement at him and they hit their mark. He stood there covered in dog excrement but maintained his dignity, and using some pretty colourful language he told the men to get off his property. Ed's a big man. He's a strong man. He stood proud. Despite what's happened to him, he reminded me that Australia is still a great country for Jewish Australians. And part of where Ed draws his strength is the support that he gets from his community and fair-minded Australians who hate seeing their fellow citizens targeted in this way. I admire Ed's stoicism and I agree with his attitude, but no Australian, regardless of their background, should have to put up with that sort of conduct. The permissibility of Jew hatred has led to an alarming degree of complacency. Now, instances of anti-Semitism have become so commonplace that only the most extreme ones get more than a moment of media reporting. The events in our country post-October 7 have revealed a dangerous underbelly in Australia and given licence to others, including those in power, to turn a blind eye or in some cases to speak freely about their own previously guarded anti-Semitism. Australia's institutions have previously operated as stabilisers and grounding points to uphold and defend our democratic values. But what happens when the very institutions charged with that essential role fail to tackle, or worse, become part of the problem? Too often, since the 7th of October, government and institutions have failed to provide the moral leadership necessary to deal with these issues. Let me provide 3 examples. First is the universities. Even before the 7th of October, campus anti-Semitism had been a problem for decades. In August 2023, 2 months before the Hamas terrorist attacks, the Australian Jewish University Survey revealed that 64% of Jewish university students had experienced anti-Semitism on campus. 57% had hidden the fact they were Jewish. 19% had stayed away from campus because of the anti-Semitism, and when anti-Semitism occurred, 61% who made a complaint were dissatisfied with the outcome. Let me remind you, that's August 2023, before the 7th of October. While anti-Semitism was a problem before the 7th of October, since that time it's been off the charts. The government's own special envoy on anti-Semitism, Julian Leeser, has described the situation on campus as very grave and much more serious and alarming than she'd expected. She found anti-Semitic behaviour is not only present on many campuses, but it's an embedded part of the culture. Universities have not taken appropriate action to denounce and suppress it. It's become systemic. The Jewish students are traumatised and feel isolated and unsafe. They're not participating in university life as they should. They've been told by their university administrators to stay home for their own safety. This normalised anti-Semitism is incredibly dangerous to our society, as it's an attitude and behaviour that eats away at the fabric of the mission of the tertiary sector. To date, university leadership is either in denial about how serious and normalised anti-Semitism has become on their campuses, or they've failed to truly understand what constitutes anti-Semitism and have responded by placating activist forces. Even before the appointment of the Special Envoy, I put forward a private member's bill to establish a judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus. I met with university leaders, with Jewish organisations, with staff and students in preparing the bill. Non-Jewish university administrators from around the country continue to contact me to tell me that I'm on the right track. Labor has 3 times refused to allow me to debate my bill in the House of Representatives. On one occasion, in response to me moving a suspension of standing orders, they even put forward a motion for the unconditional and unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state in response to my motion. In the Senate, Shadow Education Minister Sarah Henderson has introduced my bill, which was then referred to the Senate for an inquiry. That's right, an inquiry into whether to have an inquiry. Senators heard from Jewish students and academics and Jewish organisations. One thing particularly stood out to me. In almost 700 submissions, the overwhelming number were name withheld or treated confidentially. This is almost unprecedented for a federal parliamentary inquiry, but it speaks to the security concerns and the fears of retribution faced by many Jewish students and academics. The Judicial Inquiry Bill is supported by every major Jewish organisation in the country. It's a bill that's supported by the government's own Special Envoy, Jill Siegel. It's a bill that's not opposed by the Human Rights Commission, which was the alternative place to send the inquiry, and it's a bill that is not opposed by the universities. And yet this government refuses to adopt the judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on Australian university campuses. Despite the powerful dissenting report of Coalition Senators Sarah Henderson and Paul Scarr, the Labor-controlled committee has sought to refer the issue of campus anti-Semitism to the partisan Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, another political exercise with a committee full of grandstanding Greens, which will just put Jewish staff and students in the same position as before. In the meantime, the Coalition is committed to the judicial inquiry into anti-Semitism on campus as a coalition policy. We believe the judicial inquiry is the only way to effectively investigate these instances of anti-Semitism on campus, led by an independent and respected jurist with full investigatory powers, assisted by skilled cross-examiners. Only a judicial inquiry could hear evidence confidentially without witnesses fearing reprisals. Such an inquiry provides the best chance to ensure that anti-Semitism on campus, which is a long-running cultural problem and a serious concern for the social cohesion in our country, is properly addressed. But by failing to listen to their own anti-Semitism envoy, by sitting on their hands proposing an ineffective alternative, Labor is demonstrating contempt towards the Jewish community, and the radical campus activists are taking note. The second institution that has been failing to uphold social cohesion is the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission is an organisation that's supposed to deal with racism and social cohesion. And yet, as I've said in the past in relation to dealing with anti-Semitism, the AHRC has been AWOL. Now, although the Commission does well from the Australian taxpayer, it's failed by any objective measure to protect all Australians from prejudice and hate. Indeed, some of its own staff and contractors have been the lead perpetrators of such hatred and vile anti-Semitism. To give one example, when the sustained anti-Jewish online activities of one of their staff members were discovered and questioned by the media, the Commission sided with their staff member. No action, no comment. When months later the same staff member was found to have continued and increased the intensity of her online hatred, including promoting a protest at the Prime Minister's office, the Commission quietly noted that the person no longer worked there, rather than calling out the incident and terminating their employment. Following the 7 October attacks, no Commissioner made a speech, or gave a statement, or unequivocally condemned the October 7 terrorist attacks or the anti-Semitism in this country for more than 6 months. There was no special hotline or services established to support Australia's Jewish community, despite the more than 700% increase in anti-Semitism. Indeed, there was a reckless indifference to the attacks and any effect they might have had here in Australia. This is despite the Commission's role as dealing with racism in Australia. One Commissioner, Lorraine Finlay, it must be said, finally did speak up. The Commission can't do their job if there's systemic racism against one group of Australians which it's designed to serve, and if that community has no confidence in the ability of the Commission to deal with them. I put a series of questions to the Attorney-General as the responsible minister in charge of the Commission about the Commission's performance. But when I asked the Attorney about the extent to which he'd made inquiries into the rank anti-Semitism inside the organisation, including whether he'd spoken to the Commission about its employment and contracting policies to ensure there was no bias against Jewish Australians, or if the Attorney asked the Commission at any point to undertake an audit of its staff and contractors to see whether anyone else had engaged in acts of racism against Jewish Australians, my questions went unanswered. Finally, more than 80 days later, with a blunt bureaucratic answer, the Attorney explained the Commission was an independent statutory agency and in effect there's nothing to see here. The Commission has failed in its charter. They failed to take anti-Semitism seriously, and their Minister, the Attorney-General, is not taking these issues seriously either. The Commission now has a new president, and to his credit, he has made one speech on anti-Semitism. But there's no evidence that he's taken all necessary measures to ensure that the Jew hatred which became endemic in that organisation has been properly rooted out. But what happens, and this is my third example, when one of the mainstream political parties in Australia adopts anti-Semitism as one of their key doctrines? What happens when they take a Corbynite posture? How does that help social cohesion? And what should the response of other political parties be? Australians vote for the Greens thinking they're a party concerned with the environment. In Parliament, political parties express their priorities through moving suspensions of standing orders to get issues urgently debated. Of the 32 suspensions of standing orders in both houses moved by the Greens since the 7th of October, only 15% relate to the environment, while nearly half relate to the Middle East. The Greens have become a party obsessed with Jews and Israel. The Australian Greens have refused to condemn the terrorist attacks of October 7. They voted against or absented themselves from all resolutions, doing so in every Australian parliament. Greens leaders have difficulty in saying that Hamas is a terrorist organisation or that it should be disbanded. A Victorian Greens MP refuses to say that Israel should have the right to exist. A New South Wales Greens parliamentarian said that Jews have tentacles and shouldn't be able to participate in the public life of this country. She wasn't condemned by any of her colleagues. Greens MPs and senators attend and participate in violent protests and riots. They encouraged their own people to go to the Opera House on October 9, and they've done everything to undermine social cohesion in this country. They refused to condemn the phrase "from the river to the sea." In fact, they used the phrase themselves, effectively calling for the genocide of a people. One senator, Marine Fariki, posted a photo of herself dressed in a keffiyeh next to a sign that said "Keep the world clean," with a photo of the Star of David being put into a rubbish bin. The Greens have endorsed a candidate who is the president of an organisation which has posted online statements in support of terrorists. The Greens endorsed a rally where the flags of listed terrorist organisations were displayed and participated in the Melbourne riots. The Greens have engaged in intimidatory demonstrations outside electorate offices and spread misinformation about Australia's involvement with the Israel-Hamas war, and they've rightly been condemned by the Prime Minister and his senior ministers. Now, given the conduct of the Greens, a party that is promoting anti-Semitic attitudes, last November I called for all the major political parties to put the Greens last and give the Greens the same treatment that One Nation got in the late 1990s. While the coalitions agreed to put the Greens last, Labor talks a big game, but the real test will be what they do with their preferences. Will they aid more and abet more Greens with these sorts of attitudes to get into federal parliament on the back of their preferences? And in the event of a hung parliament, what issues, values or communities will they be willing to sacrifice to the Greens in order to form government with their support? As I've illustrated, when it comes to our political parties, the Human Rights Commission and the universities, their failure to address anti-Semitism is weakening our social cohesion. But in a time when people are thumbing their noses at the law, what role can the law play in helping to restore social cohesion? First, I agree with my friend James Patterson, the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, where he said that Australia faces a crisis of law enforcement. We need police and those in authority to enforce the laws already on the books. We need government ministers to send unequivocal signals that enforcing the law is a baseline expectation. But the conduct of some and the failures to enforce can also reveal gaps in the law that need to be plugged. When Australia lists a terrorist organisation, that should mean something. It should mean that Australians should have nothing to do with that organisation in any form. They shouldn't demonstrate any support or glorify such an organisation. Following some of the more brazen protests where terrorists were mourned and praised as martyrs, a small number of charges were laid. These charges were limited and brought only against those flying a flag emblazoned with a terrorist symbol. Other radical protesters have found ways of avoiding the law, yet they still make their point by displaying symbols that may not be the precise emblem of a terrorist organisation, yet which resemble something remarkably similar as if it were a terrorist symbol. These people have thumbed their nose at the law, which is actually designed to catch precisely that sort of conduct. At the heart of our laws, what must be considered is the intention of the act, not just the act in and of itself. Does the act of displaying a symbol with similar characteristics to a terrorist organisation have the same desired intent? I would argue in the case of recent pro-Hezbollah and pro-Hamas protests it does. And I think the law needs to be strengthened to ensure that intent to show support for the actions of a terrorist organisation, including by displaying a like symbol, should also be caught by the law. Similarly, displaying the image of a prominent person who's associated with or representative of a listed terrorist organisation, or an image bearing a likeness to such a person, is also the sort of conduct that should be made a criminal offence. Our laws must say that there is a zero tolerance in support for terrorists and for terrorist organisation in any way, shape or form. It's actually extraordinary hearing myself say that and that should be in any way controversial. But in Australia in 2024 it is. Our laws must indicate to law enforcement that we expect them to apply a zero tolerance test in dealing with those who seek to damage Australia's social cohesion. Our laws must always make Australia and Australians safer. And our Parliament needs to give consideration to further strengthening these laws. Now, changing the law doesn't immediately solve the many issues facing Australia today, although ensuring that hate symbols or symbols associated with or designed to be in support of listed terrorist organisations are not able to be displayed in this country is definitely a step in the right direction. In closing, let me return to where I started. Today we farewelled the King from our shores. And I'm not rubbing in the monarchy bit because I know of Gerard's involvement in the Republican movement, but the King's here and I thought it was worthwhile while finishing off with some words from His Majesty. In seeing the King here, I'm reminded of the words he spoke only weeks ago about the underlying virtues in countries bound together by parliamentary democracy. The King spoke of wisdom, of justice, of compassion and integrity. The King said this of our times: we're often told that we live in an era of polarisation and division. If that's so, then it's perhaps even more important, not less, that in the vital areas of representation, of political debate, of policy making and of discourse, these values, together with hope, civility and generosity of spirit, are never far from the heart of even the most difficult of issues. Friends, in this time, this is the sort of Australia we must all strive to build. A country of justice, compassion, hope and civility, where generosity towards supporter and opponent where with generosity towards supporter and opponent, we work to strengthen the cords between all of us and with all around the world who seek freedom, security and fairness. And that starts with enforcing the law. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to Julian Leeser for a thorough analysis, well documented, an important speech. So we come to questions and discussion now. Everyone could keep their comments fairly brief. I may come back in again later, but for now, the people in this room, our Zoomers, know a lot of stuff, but some people will see this on film later on may not. So just tell us about the Jewish community in Australia. It's actually quite small. Just give us a brief background about Jews in Australia.
Thanks, Gerard. There's about 100,000 Jews in Australia, and one of the great things about this country is that there have been Jews in Australia since the First Fleet. And Australia is one of the few countries on the planet where there's never been any formal discrimination against Jews. And so when discrimination is removed, people flourish. And so you've had Jewish people contributing to this country from the get-go. It might interest people to know that a Jewish person served in the State Legislative Council some years before the first Jew was admitted to the House of Commons. And in this state, Saul Samuel, the same person, was the first Jew anywhere in the Commonwealth, in the Empire as it was then, to serve as a Minister of the Crown. We've had famous Jewish people like John Monash and Isaac Isaacs, like Frank Lowy and Josh Frydenberg. People have contributed in every way, shape or form. Jewish people, like the rest of the community, are engaged in supporting political parties of every imaginable stripe, and causes of every imaginable stripe. There's even great Jewish sports people like Jessica Fox. So there are people who are called to make a contribution, to be, in the words of Jonathan Sachs, the former Chief Rabbi of the Commonwealth, true to our faith and a blessing to others regardless of their faith.
There we are. So there's a question here.
Actually, it's not a question. I just want to say that 86 years ago in Vienna, on Kristallnacht, my mother and her parents and her parents-in-law-to-be and her sister were arrested because they were Jewish. And here I am now, and I'm going through, similar fears of anti-Semitism. That's all I want to say.
Ruth, you're not alone in
that. Just 1 minute.
Also.
You might just background Kristallnacht for those who don't understand. Okay.
Kristallnacht was the night of broken glass. It was effectively a Nazi pogrom against Jews in Europe in 1938. They broke shops, they beat up Jewish shopkeepers and Jewish people, and they rounded up and killed several of them. You're not alone, Ruth, in having a sense of PTSD from that time. So many Jewish Australians, so many people of my age, I'm 48, talk about the stories our grandparents told us. Is this a time to sort of put your head down and take your mezuzah off your door, the little bit of parchment with passages from Deuteronomy there that remind us of our beliefs. And I understand that particular view. But I think Ed from Avners is right. This is actually a time where we need to stand tall and to stand proudly because this country is worth fighting for. As I said, Australia has been one of those unique places where there has never been any formal discrimination against Jews. That is not true of anywhere in Europe. That is not true of some of the states in the United States. But that is certainly true of this country. And it's not just a good country for Jews, it's a good country for anybody who wants to obey the law and have a go. And we need to fight for this country whether we're Jewish or not, on the basis that we need to return to those key values of allowing it to be a place where anybody, regardless of their background, can succeed if they obey the law and have a go. Yeah.
Thanks for your lecture, Julian. It's very, very timely and very heartfelt. Just make a very brief comment and then a question. Very brief. I find it really very distressing that a non-Jewish organisation on October 7 held a vigil down at Circular Quay, but there was a huge queue of riot police stopping them going to the Opera House because they were told they're not allowed to go there. So I find that a little bit strange given what happened on the previous year. But my question is this. I've asked this question to numerous politicians, and I've got various answers depending on the party. And the question is it a problem related to lax laws, or is it a problem related to political will? There has not been a significant prosecution in relation to hate speech.
I think it is a problem relating to enforcement of those people who are charged with dealing with prosecutions. Obviously, politicians are not engaged in prosecutions except in very rare circumstances. But what politicians can do is send signals to the agencies that are, even the independent agencies within their control, that there is an expectation that the laws will be enforced and dealt with. And I think that hasn't been done effectively in our country. And, the example I gave you there with writing to Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney-General who's responsible for the Human Rights Commission. The fact that, he couldn't write back to me and say, I did contact the Commission because I was concerned about some of these issues, and put it on the record and say, yes, this worries me too, and I've done something about it because I'm the bloke in the position to do something about it. I mean, he was happy to call in the President of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal and give her a dressing down, but he wasn't happy to answer my questions about what he'd done with the Human Rights Commission, about expressing some concern about this out-of-control anti-Semitism that's there.
Julian, my friend has probably asked you the same question in many ways that I'm going to ask you, but the lawlessness that you describe reminds me of the origin of the Greek word anarchy, which means no archon, no leader. It's a problem of leadership, basically, isn't it? We've seen no leadership from the government in this country over this, what's happening. And I think that's looking very much towards your party and Peter Dutton to remedy this situation.
This is a time for moral clarity, and Peter Dutton has demonstrated remarkable moral clarity on all these issues. It's about political leaders calling out what is right and what is wrong and being very clear, not having a bet each way. And I think right from the get-go, the government has been trying to have a bet each way on some of these things because they've got a complex web of constituencies they're trying to appease. They're trying to appease their Green opponents in the inner cities, and they're trying to deal with people supporting Islamist parties in Western Sydney, and they're caught. Whereas Peter Dutton has just gone, this is the right thing to do, this is what Australia's about. This is not about the enormous number of votes of the Jewish community, because we're only a community of 100,000 people. This is about where Australia's going and what's right. And so he's been strong on every occasion calling this out. And I agree with you. I think we do need strong moral leadership in this country to help steady the ship. And this has been so much a failure of political leaders to have moral clarity on these issues.
Julian, thank you. As a non-Jew, I'd really like you to tell me what it is about the Jewish culture and religion that stops them from forever claiming victim status, as so many other groups that get hard times do.
There's a wonderful joke about Jewish festivals that's sort of expressed in a three-part, in three sentences. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. The sense that I think of the Jewish people that we've seen all of this before, and that our story is about continuity, our story is about living your life in a particular way, being living by your laws and having a sense of, well, it's all about what's here on earth, and it's about the contribution that you make here and living according to the laws of God here. And I think that gives people a strong sense of purpose. I think as well that there's a sense that, your destiny is in your hands. I mean, we believe very strongly, as Christians believe as well, in the dignity of the human person, that whoever we are, we're all born with individual dignity that stems from the fact that we're all created in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, with our individual dignity and our individual talents, it's up to us to make something of those things. I also think the very strong tradition in the Jewish community of education that is born of the need to read the Torah in a foreign language also encourages people to to work and strive and be educated and so on. You always have a sense of your history. And what Ruth talked about, you heard about that from her grandparents' generation. You hear about Pharaoh in Egypt and the pogroms, and you hear about the Inquisition and so on, and you know that history. And deep within the DNA of all of us, there's a sense of that. But there's also a sense of us surviving. And the survival is the amazing part. And the survival to do good works in the world today, that's what it's all about.
Julian, Will Cummins. I'll make it very quick. I'm sorry, I've got to run off, and I thought it was fantastic what you said. 100% support. With the Muslim party that they want to formulate, I think that could be the beginning and the end. I'm a practicing Catholic. I'm not going to make any comments about Islam. I'm a very big supporter of, I think you know where I'm going with this, of Judaism as well, Judaism, Christian principles, 200 years with this country. What are your thoughts about this Muslim parties? I think it could be the beginning of the end.
Look, I think it goes back to the point I was making in response to the question down here. This is Labor having been completely pinned and wriggling on these issues and not being clear about where they stood. They're getting criticised by Muslims for not having been tougher on Israel. They're getting criticised by ordinary Australians and people in the Jewish community for not standing up for values, and so they've not done a good job of anything. They need to pick a side and firmly pick a side, and they should do what Peter Dutton has done, which is stand with the traditional values of Australians. And I think that strong stance sends a signal to Australians more broadly. I think it is a sign of weakening social cohesion that in this day and age there are sectarian parties that are emerging. I mean, we have had religious-based parties in Australia before. It's not that long ago that we had the Christian Democrats here. But I think the fact that it is emerging today is a real cause for concern for the social cohesion of the country.
Before I ask this question from Canberra, I should say, in fairness, Attorney General Dreyfus was here a couple of months ago. He took a question from Ruth there and gave a very strong statement against anti-Semitism in Australia, which is on our website. I mentioned in my column in The Australian, so just a background there. But this goes back to your question, your comment. Dennis from Canberra says, how do we get the Human Rights Commission to do its job to protect the rights of all Australians, including Jewish Australians?
Well, that's the first point. It is there to protect the rights of all Australians. That's a very important point. I met with the new president of the Commission and I told him I believed he needed to do two things. Number one is be very clear and make a strong couple of speeches on anti-Semitism and its problems, because it beggared belief to me that the Commission president and the Race Discrimination Commissioner still haven't made, his predecessor hadn't made a speech since the 7th of October on anti-Semitism, and the Race Discrimination Commissioner still, I don't think, has made a speech on anti-Semitism, which is just amazing given that the Race Discrimination Commissioner is responsible for the Human Rights Act. But the second thing he must do is the matters that I wrote to Mark Dreyfus about. He must restore public confidence in the Commission that they've actually dealt with the anti-Semitism of their staff and contractors. There are so many stories of anti-Semitism of the Human Rights Commission staff and contractors that how can a Jewish person who has a matter before the Commission think that they are being fairly dealt with? So these are matters for the Commission President to deal with, and they're ultimately matters for the Attorney General of Australia to ensure that the Commission President is actually dealing with. And you can rest assured that my colleagues in Senate Estimates will be asking questions on these matters, as they have done repeatedly of the Commission since the 7th of October.
Julian, unfortunately in this last year, what we've experienced is partly due to an enormous ignorance of this ongoing feud between those who are anti-Israel in the Middle East and those who are not. How can we overcome the ignorance? I mean, the other day, even the French president, is Macron the French president, was criticised, well, I can never remember which Prime Minister president, he was criticised by Netanyahu for having no idea how Israel was set up. If he can get it all wrong, and it goes back much further than the setting up of Israel. I'm reading a book on 1929 in Hebron, which the parallels for now are just so much the same. This ancient story that's reflected now in much bigger and anti-Western enemies how can we get the real story out, that this is not simply about anti-Semitism, it's about a bigger struggle, and that struggle has a just advocacy. What do you do?
I think this is a huge question. It's partly due to the fact of the sort of de-Christianising of the West. The number of young Australians now who know anything about the Bible stories, when you talk to them about Israel and you talk to them about Abraham, they are just as likely to look blankly at you. Stories that, even in my age would have been commonplace are just less common. And I know this from, to give you an example in my own staff. It's very rare that I have anyone who's Jewish working for me. And my staff often deal with people in the Jewish community who will call up. And so I sometimes have someone from the community come and talk about Israel and talk about what it is to be Jewish and what that means and why there are people who have some of the concerns that Ruth has and talk about the experience. And in the 8 years I've been there, and I have terrific staff, I think they're wonderful people. But in the 8 years I've been there, I've noticed how fewer people actually have that background and that knowledge, and I think that's expressed more broadly. I might give an advert. There's one thing I'm doing that is helping strike a blow for Western civilisation in this regard, and that's I'm lucky to be on the board of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. And part of what it is doing in the courses that it has at the 3 universities is equating people with the stories of the Bible, so they've got some historical context of some of the things that made the West what it is, in its great successes, and some of those Judeo-Christian values which otherwise are not present.
We're getting towards the end. Everyone's got to be brief.
Yeah, if I can just make a quick comment. I'm a convent-educated girl, and I have 13 grandchildren between the ages of 18 and 25. So even the youngest is now eligible to vote. And I've spent a lot of time actually acquainting myself with Jewish history to make sure I understand. And I'm very aware that in the Middle Ages, Jewish people were banned from going to universities. They were not allowed to. So they had to become traders. And then when the people who were educated in universities went to them to borrow money because they had earned money, they had the audacity to resent the fact that they were charged interest. And I take the view that basically we're not educating our young Australians on really understanding the background and the history of our Jewish people. I admire you and I admire the many Jewish friends I have. And please keep as strong as you are.
Thanks, Imelda. Appreciate it.
Okay, so down the back and then here. Jeremy Breeze.
Thanks very much for that presentation. I wonder, we've considered the matters about universities. Sydney University used to have an entity called the Department of Semitic Studies, and Semitic was in the very broad sense of that term, people from the Middle East. It was headed by Professor Rifat Abid, who was of Egyptian provenance, whose field was Christian-Islam interactions, I think. But is there not a place for academic studies drawing on the three Abrahamic religions to address these sorts of issues?
There's lots of that work that's going on all around the world, certainly before the 7th of October. In my university days at ACU, I was engaged with scholars who were doing that work. Some of it takes place in Australia as well. So it's a good question.
Listen, you've got to be brief, okay?
It's a statement more than a question. Look, In Defence of Israel is actually a book written by Alan Dershowitz. And one of the things I don't think you've covered in this thing is a defence of the State of Israel, which is not only reflects the same sort of social and moral values that I hope we as Australians represent, but really it goes beyond that, particularly with the present dispute in Israel over the constitution of the Supreme Court there. Okay, well that's my comment.
Thank you. Do you want me to I can come back here and give another speech on the state of Israel if you like, but I agree with what you've said.
Julian, can you contrast the civil society repair efforts post the Cronulla riots and post October 7?
That's a really great question. I think post-Cronulla riots, there was a really strong sense and strong effort made to bring Australians together. And I think particularly about the efforts of people like Scott Morrison and Jason Clare, bringing people from the two communities that they represented to do things like the Kokoda Track together. But the difference between then and now is this shouldn't be seen as a war between Jews and Muslims. That's not the way in which it should be presented, particularly in this country. Because what's different about this is that you've got these actors of the inner city left, the people in the chambray shirts with the R.M. Williams and the chinos on, who are running lines from woke philosophy, basically saying that, effectively, there are the privileged, there's the oppressors, the oppressed. Jewish people are the oppressors, and if you want to end white privilege, you've got to attack Jewish privilege. That element was not there at the time of the Cronulla riots. This anti-Semitism that we are seeing is much deeper than what was there. And what we didn't see at the time of the Cronulla riots was a failure in leadership. In fact, we saw quite the opposite, as the example I'm giving you in relation to Scott Morrison and Jason Clare indicates.
So, final question. If you were to come back here in 12 months' time, what do you think you'd be telling us then?
Well, I'm going to pick up what Vicky asked me before, the comment that she made. I think if we'd had a change of government, I don't think we're going to have these issues about anti-Semitism and social cohesion, because I think Peter Dutton has made such a strong pitch in relation to this, and it is a massive point of difference between the two parties going into the election. If the government has been returned, and if the government is returned, it's most likely to be returned as part of a hung parliament in government with the Greens. I fear where we are going to go on this, and I fear some of the demands that the Greens will make of the Prime Minister in order to maintain government. We know already that the Greens have said that they will make the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state, and Labor's almost there at any rate, one of the conditions of their support in a hung parliament. Who knows what else they're going to ask, but I think it will be a bad time for people who like Australia the way it is and believe that law-abiding people, particularly Jewish Australians, have deserved the right to participate in the public life in this country and be free to make the contribution that they have so well made, because they've been allowed to make over 200 years in this place. Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of people here. We're right on time, so I'll be very brief. Many thanks to Julian Leeser for a very strong, well-written, strong speech, which will live on, but also for providing evidence to support your propositions, which is always very important. So, and for handling the question so well. So, thanks for coming here tonight and talking about what is a very important social cohesion question in contemporary Australia. We've never experienced this sort of feeling here before of anti-Semitism, and well done, and we'll have you back sometime. Thank you.